Although this theory has very little support among scholars today, it is still quite popular on atheist websites. A student is therefore more likely to hear it from a classmate than a professor. The theory claims Jesus never existed as a historical figure. Rather, the stories of his birth, life, death, and resurrection were all myths the early Christians borrowed from pagan mystery religions, such as the cults of Dionysus and Mithras, which allegedly predated Christianity by centuries. The roots of the Christ myth theory go back to 19th-century German scholars like David Strauss, who argued the New Testament is simply a collection of mythical retellings of Jesus' life, and Bruno Bauer, who made the more radical claim Jesus never existed. The theory gained prominence for a time in the history of religion school at the University of Göttingen, but began to decline during the 20th century, as scholars examined the evidence more closely. Richard Carrier and Robert Price still make this claim today, but even non-Christian scholars like Bart Ehrman refute it. The general consensus today is that most of the alleged parallels between Christianity and the mystery religions are either non-existent, sometimes pure fabrications, coincidental, or anachronistic. In fact, there is no evidence pagan mystery religions existed in first-century Israel, and much of our evidence for them elsewhere dates to after the rise of Christianity. So if any borrowing did happen, it was probably the other way around. This theory, more popular among critical scholars, is based on a certain reading of some of Jesus' apocalyptic prophecies, such as those found in Matthew 16:28 and 24:34, in which Jesus predicts God's kingdom will arrive, accompanied by cataclysmic celestial signs, within the lifetime of his disciples. They argue that since the world did not end within the lifetime of his disciples, he must have been deluded, and the whole Christian religion is based on a mistake. Further, many who hold this view deny Jesus ever claimed to be divine. He may have seen himself as a prophet or perhaps even a king, but certainly not the pre-existent Son of God. This means we can trust very little of what the New Testament tells us about Jesus, unless it seems to make him look bad. This is known as the criterion of embarrassment. For its strengths and weaknesses see Jesus, criteria, and the demise of authenticity. The failed prophet theory is generally traced to the German scholar Albert Schweitzer. Though Schweitzer was right to draw attention to the eschatological and time character of Jesus' message, he tended to cherry-pick the evidence, highlighting some prophetic statements while ignoring others. Such as Jesus' claims that God's kingdom was a present reality, or his own confession of ignorance regarding the timing of his return. Critics following Schweitzer also mistakenly suppose that first-century Jewish apocalyptic language, such as the sun being darkened, stars falling from heaven, etc., must have been intended literally. A comparison with Peter's sermon at Pentecost shows this is not always the case. Jesus was certainly expecting something climactic to happen within his disciples' lifetime, but it was not necessarily the end of the physical universe. God's kingdom, as Jesus saw it, defied expectations. If the failed prophet theory tends to exaggerate Jesus' apocalyptic expectations, the moral philosopher theory tends to ignore them altogether. This portrayal of Jesus, as a wisdom teacher promoting timeless moral truths, is fairly common among non-Christian lay people, but among scholars it has often taken the more specific shape of Jesus as cynic philosopher. The term cynic in the Greco-Roman world didn't refer to a generally pessimistic or distrusting person, as we ordinarily use it today, but rather one who renounced worldly goods and social conventions. Critical of the materialism and hypocrisy they saw around them, cynics would often refuse to groom or bathe, even performing bodily functions in public and earning the nickname dogman, which is the meaning of cynic in Greek. The cynic Jesus theory is usually associated with members of the Jesus Seminar, which reached its heyday in the 1980s and 1990s. Some of these scholars, such as Burton Mack and John Dominic Crossan, helpfully pointed out a number of similarities between Jesus and cynic philosophy. However, there are at least two fatal flaws to the portrayal of Jesus as a cynic himself. First, we have no historical evidence of the presence of cynic philosophy in Galilee at the time of Jesus. In fact, the evidence we do possess reveals strong Jewish resistance to pagan influence in Galilee. Second, the differences between Jesus and cynic philosophy far outweigh the similarities. Today, very few in the scholarly world continue to promote this theory. This is an old theory about Jesus that pops up every now and again, but it has never gained much traction. Its roots go back to the man credited with launching the first modern quest for the historical Jesus, German deist Hermann Reimarus. Reimarus argued Jesus never intended to found a new religion, or die for the sins of humanity. Rather, his message was a call to national liberation from Roman oppression, which ended in failure and crucifixion. This theory was later revived in the 20th century by S.G.F. Brandon, who claimed Jesus was influenced by the first-century Zealot movement. And it has once again made headlines with Reza Aslan's 2013 bestseller, Zealot: The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth by Random House. As with other alternative portraits of Jesus, this one relies upon a cherry-picking approach to the evidence. It highlights the socio-political aspects of Jesus' kingdom proclamation, while disregarding the spiritual aspects. As New Testament scholar Darrell Bock points out, Jesus declares the arrival of the kingdom not through amassing an army, but through casting out demons and healing the sick. The enemies Jesus targets are not the Romans but the spiritual forces that hold the world in captivity to sin. In fact, Jesus' strongest criticisms in the Gospels are directed not at the Romans, but at his Jewish compatriots who expected God to vindicate them based on their nationalistic zeal and rigorous adherence to the law. It is also worth remembering that one of Jesus' own disciples was a tax collector, hardly what you'd expect from an anti-Roman revolutionary movement. A few scholars have given up altogether on the quest for the historical Jesus. For them, determining what Jesus actually said and did is not only near impossible, but also beside the point. The purpose of the New Testament, they say, is to bring us into a one-on-one personal encounter with God. Not to communicate certain alleged facts about the past, facts that probably are not all that factual to begin with. This theory goes back to German scholar Rudolf Bultmann, who promoted a demythologizing approach to Scripture. This involved getting past all the imaginative and irrelevant details of the Gospel stories about Jesus and reaching what Bultmann saw as the central truth of Christianity: the kerygma, Greek for proclamation of the Gospel. This kerygma was defined in existentialist terms, stressing an individual's experience of God and a personal call to decision. Like other critical scholars before him, Bultmann accepted the wall of separation between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. But whereas other scholars tried to use history to undermine faith, Bultmann tried to insulate faith from history. One could say he treated the New Testament almost like an ear of corn. History was the husk, kerygma the kernel. The problem with this approach, of course, is that it is entirely subjective. If we cannot trust what the New Testament tells us Jesus said and did, then we are free to define him however we wish. Who decides what the essence of the gospel is, if not Jesus himself?